Welcome back, Honors. So, it's good to see you guys again. We stopped right about here in class today. I'm guessing at this because I'm actually recording this before I have you guys at the end of the day, so we'll see if I actually luck out. Now, if we got to catch up or whatever, we will. It's not a big deal. But anyway, we stopped talking right around when we were talking about Mesopotamian religion, their polytheistic ideas, getting into their temples, things like that. But just to give you a heads up, they are very close in Egypt when it comes to one thing. They're not quite a theocracy, though. So, according to their faith, the position of king was enhanced and supported by their religion. As in, like, they have a direct line to the gods. And they are also placed there by the gods. However, they didn't believe that he was a part of God themselves, much like the Egyptians did. Now, kingship also was believed to be created by the gods, and the king's power was divinely righted out to rule. The irony is that we believe, so many people believe that this is an ancient idea, that carried over all the way to the 1600s in Europe. European monarchs claimed that for hundreds of years. Now, each god, also according to Mesopotamian religion, had control over certain things, and each city was believed to have their own patron god or goddess, or ruled over by specific deities or gods themselves. Now, speaking of complex organized religion, especially in our very first civilization that we're discussing, everybody always asks the question, well, where did they come up with these myths? Like, did they just, like, pull them out of thin air? Like, where are they coming from? 9 times out of 10, depends on the culture you're looking at, but in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they usually came from priests. And priests would participate in different ceremonies or in different aspects, ideas, or large-scale prayers to try and basically put themselves in a state of trance to try and communicate with the gods. Very famous people that you know of, that you've heard of before, that did this for the Greeks are called oracles, right? The big one was the Oracle of Delphi. Now, kings and priests, though, in in Mesopotamia, they acted as interpreters as they told people what the gods wanted them to do. One of the famous examples of what we believe the Mesopotamians actually did, though, was that they would actually cut open a sheep's stomach and allow all of the organs and things like that to fall out of it while the sheep was still alive, and then they would actually examine the liver and the lungs of the slain sheep and then actually try to interpret it, much like you would interpret like tea leaves if you were to go to a psychic or something like that. So, to keep going, though, speaking of their prayer temples, we've got to talk about ziggurats, right? So ziggurats are their huge, gigantic prayer temples that the Mesopotamians would build, layer upon layer of mud bricks that they would actually craft and forge themselves. Now, they usually did it in a pyramid-style shape. However, the Egyptian pyramids were done in much more of a triangular pyramid, whereas ziggurats were done much more as a square-based pyramid, feeding up one square on top of each other. This right here is a really good example of a ziggurat. And this one's the best one. And it's still hanging out. It's from 2000 BC. And that's the ziggurat of Now, my favorite city-state name in all of Mesopotamia. Just So, anyway. Now, the shape of the pyramid, though, was in that of many tiers. And inside of these ziggurats was a room for offerings, for food, for goods. This was much more of a temple for prayer of sorts. Also, all of the taxes that were collected went to these ziggurats as well. Because here's the ultimate irony. The king's position was elevated by their religion, but the religious authorities had the most control over day-to-day lives of the people that lived within Mesopotamia. All of the priests actually owned the land, and it was believed that farmers only rented that land from the religious orders, and their taxes were in the form of these crops, right? And they would actually go to offerings to the temple, and they could possibly be redistributed if necessary, right? Now, the most famous ziggurat that we believe is probably a ziggurat was the Tower of Babel, which we believe was built over 100 meters above ground and was 91 meters at the base, which is humongous. And, of course, this is the illustration of the Tower of Babel that y'all know of from the Old Testament. The best thing about this illustration is that, of course, it's just kind of really neat to connect a lot of these religions together. And the Tower of Babel is from the Old Testament of the Bible. And I really don't know what book it's in. Extra credit. When the bell rings to leave homeroom tomorrow, first kid to come tell me what book the Tower of Babel is described in the Bible, I'll give you extra credit on your first test. So, anyway, but of course the Tower of Babel was built too tall, and then God actually, because they were trying to communicate with God, that God struck them down and cursed them with slain tongues, right? And he actually was responsible for all the different languages the world speaks now. Well, ironically enough, we believe that there's a chance that this was the Sumerians or the Acadians trying to build this. And the reason why they think that the Hebrews actually wrote the book that way, or made the story, created the story, it's probably due to the fact that the tower may have actually collapsed. Also, that the Mesopotamians and the Sumerians and the Acadians actually spoke a different language from the native Hebrew that the Hebrews themselves actually speak. Speaking of the Sumerians, we're going to bang out the important guys in the Mesopotamian region. We're going to talk Sumerians, Acadians. We will wait on the Assyrians. We'll come back to them. Babylonians, though, are a big one as well. If we get a chance, we'll talk about Neo-Babylonians, but we may not, all right? Because they were only around for like a couple hundred years. Sorry about that. But speaking of the Sumerians, they were the very first civilization, large city-state in the region that you know of as Mesopotamia. Their biggest contribution, of course, is the process of irrigation, all right? And we talked about that already, Dan Becker, with like, you know, his little, like trying to water his crops and stuff like that. Now, they produce three main crops with these irrigated fields. The biggest ones, after doing some more research last night, wheat was a huge one, but many historians believe what we call wheat, they may have actually used barley. They also cultivated dates, which my wife loves dates. I don't like them that much. I'd rather have a raisin. Now, and sesame seeds. They also built canals, dikes, dams, and drainage systems to actually prevent flooding of their agricultural bases. They also, the biggest thing is that they developed was a cuneiformic writing. Probably actually invented just so they could keep track of taxation, keep records, and actually document events. So they also invented the wheel, which is great. You know what I mean? What do you think that was like when, like, hypothetically, we're all Sumerians, and then all of a sudden, Ryan Davis shows up with this wheel. He's like, hey, check it out. It's round. Go that way. So anyway, make millions. And then they come out with the iWheel about like 20 years later. Apple takes it over. Now, anyway, the abundance of food, though, led to a don't write abundance, put surplus. That's a better word, money word, right? Surplus of food led to a steady increase of population, farms, towns, cities. They're then going to develop a large-based trade system with bartering as its economic base, right? They would mainly barter barley, but also wool and cloth for stone, metals, timber, copper, pearls, ivory, luxury items, things like that, all right? So bartering was their basis. They would actually trade, and each party would decide on the agreed-upon price. So then enter the Acadians, who actually took over the Sumerians, because they had the ability to unite lower Mesopotamia and then come up and usurp the Sumerian area. So they were led by this guy named Sargon the Great. Sargon unified lower Mesopotamia after conquering the Sumerians in 2331 BC. They established their capital at Akkad, but their biggest thing is they actually held on to all the intelligence of the Sumerians and then spread it further with their types of trade. However, they were very short-lived because they were conquered by the invading Babylonians in 2200 BC. So Babylonians, massively important. They're going to reunite Mesopotamia in 1830 BC. They're centrally located, and they dominate trade, and they secure control of it. That's why they had the ability to grow at such a rapid rate. Now, yet again, they had no ability to unify the entirety of it, but they did take over major areas such as Ur, and also little areas towards Jerusalem and out towards the upper edges of the Tigris River. Now, their biggest and most important leader, like we talked about Sargon 2 seconds ago with the Acadians, is a guy you've heard of before. His name is Hammurabi, right? Hammurabi was the sixth king in the Amorite dynasty who conquered the Acadians and parts of Assyria before the Assyrians, of course, step up and take over everybody. Now, he built new walls to protect the city. You don't need to, really fast, don't write this, that, Yeah, don't write those. So don't write this one, or that one. Write the other ones. But his biggest contributions was he actually created a new economic system, and then he also used his abilities to codify law. We'll get to that in a second. But he built new walls to protect the city and the new canals and dikes to improve the crops. Their economy was based more on agriculture with wool and cloth and actually textile products. And then also, individuals were now finally outside this, under the Babylonian Empire, allowed to own land, which was huge, right? Remember I told you earlier the Sumerians weren't allowed to do that. Now, artisans and merchants also could keep most of their profits and even started to form guilds. And we'll talk about guilds when we get to the Renaissance in Europe later on. But just so you know, they're a very old school idea. Now, this is really cool, though. He also created a system of currency-based, a system of kind of constant measurements with currency basis of the grain. So grain was used as their medium of exchange. It became like basically their first forms of money. The emergence of the measurement of currency was a shekel was 108 grains of barley, and a mina was 60 shekels. So, for example, you could now ask for certain amounts instead of weights or size ideas. Like, I'll take that small pile over there. Well, on Tuesday, what if the pile is a different size? You understand? So, a mina was eventually represented, though, by metal later on, which was one of the first uses of money, but was still actually based on grain. The very first people to use a money-based economy were the Persians, which we'll talk about much later. But Hammurabi's biggest legacy is his code of law, all right? So, the biggest thing he did was to enforce rule. Hammurabi collected the laws of Babylon in a code that would actually apply to everybody in the entire land. Now, it was the most extensive law code from the ancient world, circa 1800 BC, and it was a code of 282 different laws inscribed on one huge stone pillar in a public hallway for everyone to see. Even though, ironically enough, 90% of the population couldn't read. Now, Hammurabi's stone depicts Hammurabi actually receiving God's grace from the god Shemesh and set up divinely inspired laws as well as the big ones, the societal laws. The biggest basis that you know of that this comes from is it started the concept of an eye for an eye, right? So according to Hammurabi's code, hypothetically speaking, if Dean trips Mr. Terry in the hallway and I fall and knock my two front teeth out, according to the eye for an eye, I get to knock Dean's teeth out, all right? Now, let's say hypothetically, though, but this is the weird thing. It's a little biased, and you can jot this down on your own somewhere. It's a little bit biased because, hypothetically speaking, let's say something similar happened to, I don't know, Campbell, right? Let's say Campbell gets into a fight with, I'm trying to remember some of y'all's names. Let's say Campbell gets into a fight with her older brother, Ryan, right? And Campbell is super wealthy, and her brother Ryan is dummy poor, right? And she punches him in the face. Well, according to Hammurabi's code, he gets to punch her back in the face. But since she has a lot of money, it's a little biased because since her brother is poor, she can just pay it off, right? Which set up a very unfair system of economic bias in their culture, which would eventually lead to a lot of problems. One of the craziest things, though, is that consequences for all crime depended on their rank in society. So you would only have fines for nobility. That's what I was getting at right there. My favorite law, though, is let's say hypothetically one of you were to stir up on one of your parents. According to Hammurabi's code, if a son strikes his father, they cut off your hand. Which actually, funny enough, relates to some Jewish codes that would come up later due to the fact that you're supposed to honor your father and thy mother in the Ten Commandments, right? So, some of the only physical evidence that we have of some of this stuff, though, is in this place called the Royal Tombs of Ur, right? Like I said, my favorite city-state. From 1922 to 1934, there was an excavation of a very ancient Sumerian city of Ur. City, famed in the Bible as the home of the patriarch Abraham, right? Now, you've heard of Abraham, right? Now, discoveries such as extravagant jewelry, gold, cups of gold and silver, bowls of alabaster, huge, huge objects of art and culture were actually discovered, and some of the oldest ones that we actually have. Now, it opened the world's eyes to the full extent and glory of how established the Mesopotamian people actually were. One of the neatest things that we actually saw when we discovered this this tomb, is their Great Death Pit, which shows us that they actually share some similarities with the Egyptians, because it was a massive grave that contained the bodies of 6 guards and 68 servants, because it was supposed to be a grave of a great funeral procession. All the people that died along with this king had to drink poison and kill themselves so they could actually accompany their king and queen in the afterlife. I'm really glad I didn't work for that guy. That's all I got for tonight, though. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. And sorry, I'm trying to eat my lunch. But I've been enjoying it. You guys are such studs. So impressed by y'all's ability so far. Really, really excited to get this year going in full tilt. I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good evening.